G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. This is a study prepared by Dr. Ronald Fruchtenbaum of RL Ministries in the US. Welcome to session 38. We're going to be looking at chapter 45:13 down to chapter 47 verse 12 in this session. Last session we looked at the apportioning of the land on the Millennial Mountain. The Zadokites, which were the priests who will be ministering in the temple, were in the northern section, 50 by 20 miles, inside of which we had the temple, and they live and work in this section. The Millennial Temple we saw was 1 mile square. It sits in the center of this northern section. In the central section, which was 50 by 20 miles, this is where the non-Zadokite priests, Levites were, and these were the guys who were the caretakers of the temple compound. Remember that there's no Levitical cities in the kingdom. So there are 20 chambers at the extreme northern end of this central section, and that was connecting to the territory of the Zadokites, but it was built for the Levites. These are the caretaker Levites. So in this way, those who were functioning as the caretakers and who were working around the temple would use these chambers as temporary dwellings, because remember, they would not be permitted to live in the Zadokites area since the temple is there. And they're going to travel into the Zadokite territory where the temple is to fulfill their tasks. Now, southern section was for the whole house of Israel. So members from all 12 tribes will be found living in the southern area. And it will not belong to any particular tribe, because they all have their tribal portions anyway. And that's 50 by 10 miles. City of Jerusalem in the millennial is going to be located in the southern segment of the mountain of Jehovah's house. The prince's portion, King David, remember resurrected King David, it lies on both the east and west sides of the mountain, Millennial Mountain of Jehovah's house, and it actually the whole Millennial Mountain will be actually in the center of Israel. West side of the mountain, running all the way to the border, that's Mediterranean Sea, and the east side to the eastern border of the Jordan River. Both of these sides will be the portion belonging to the prince. Now, Ezekiel gives a message to Israel's present princes, his contemporaries, in light of seeing the righteousness of Israel's future princes, and they should act in the same way today as what they're seeing acted out in the future. They should live righteously. And how do they do that? Well, one of the things is to remove violence, execute justice, and stop robbing the people of their lands. So this is the message to Ezekiel's contemporaries. And one of the things a righteous life is characterized by is by the use of just weights and measures. Okay, now we're looking at the laws of the sacrifices and offerings, which is 45:13 down to 46:24. It's a pretty long section here. Ezekiel begins to deal with the millennial law as it relates to sacrifices and offerings. And this is subdivided into some smaller sections also, so we can deal with them in smaller bites, if you like. General instructions. Now, this is verse 13 to 17. This is the oblation that you shall offer. The sixth part of an ephah from a homer of wheat, and you shall give the sixth part of an ephah from a homer of barley. And the set portion of oil to the bath of oil, tenth part of a bath out of the core, which is 10 baths, even the homer for 10 baths or a homer. And 1 lamb of the flock out of the 200 from the well-watered pastures of Israel, for a meal offering and for a burnt offering and for peace offerings, to make atonement for them, saith the Lord Jehovah. All the people of the land shall give unto this oblation for the prince in Israel. And it shall be the prince's part to give the burnt offerings and the meal offerings and the drink offerings in the feasts and on the new moons and on the Sabbath, in all the appointed feasts of the house of Israel. He shall prepare, this is the prince, he shall prepare the sin offering and the meal offering, burnt offering and the peace offerings to make atonement for the house of Israel. So, here Ezekiel is beginning to deal with the law of sacrifices. He first deals with the general instructions in verse 13 to 17. Verse 13 to 15, he deals with the oblations that they must offer, and he gives the measures which relate to them. In verse 13, the dry measure is a sixth part of an ephah from a homer of wheat, and you shall give the sixth part of an ephah from a homer of barley. Lisa brought me a message. Slow down, don't rush. Okay. In verse 15, he now deals with the actual sacrifices. It's one lamb out of the flock, out of 200 from the well-watered pastures of Israel. So out of 200 newborn lambs in a flock, one is to be donated to the prince. Also, a meal offering, a burnt offering, and a peace offering is also to be donated. And the purpose of this is to make an atonement for them. And then in verse 16, we have the recipient of their oblation. All the people of the land shall give unto this oblation for the prince in Israel. So the one who is to receive the gifts of verses 13 to 15 is the prince who we saw in last session was the resurrected King David. Then in verse 17, we're told what the duties of the prince will be. It shall be the prince's part, meaning his duty will be to give or to offer the sacrifices. It's going to be his responsibility to offer the burnt offerings, the meal offerings, and the drink offerings. Now, by the way, these drink offerings were usually wine, as we see in Numbers 15 verse 5 and Hosea 9 verse 4. Numbers 15:5, Hosea 9:4. Now, the occasions on which he's to give these offerings are in the feasts, such as the Passover, and on the new moons, that is on the first day of each month, and on the Sabbath, that is on Saturdays. So in all the appointed feasts of the house of Israel. Now, in making these statements, Ezekiel is telling us which Jewish observances are going to be in effect during the period of the Messianic kingdom. He shall prepare, that is David. David will prepare 4 types of offerings. First, the sin offering, and second, the meal offering, third, the burnt offering, fourth, the peace offering. And the purpose is stated again to make atonement for the house of Israel. Now, the nature of this atonement is commemorative or as a memorial, as we discussed before we got into chapter 44. So these are the general instructions. Now we're going to look at some specifics. We're going to look at the New Year offering in verses 18 to 20. Thus says the Lord Jehovah, in the first month, in the first day of the month, thou shalt take a young bullock without blemish, thou shalt cleanse the sanctuary, and the priest shall take of the blood of the sin offering and put it upon the doorposts of the house and upon the 4 corners of the ledge of the altar and upon the posts of the gate of the inner court. And so thou shalt do in the 7th day of the month for every one that erreth, and for him that is simple, so shall ye make atonement for the house. So in these verses, he's dealing with the New Year offering. The date of his offering is given in the first part of verse 18, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, and in the first day of the month. So the first of Nisan is to be a special day on which they would have a New Year offering. And under the Mosaic law, this was not a holy day. So this is another one of those critical differences we speak about. First day of the month was not a special occasion under Moses, but it's going to become so under the millennial system of worship. Second part of verse 18, it says to be a holy day. So the sacrifice on this occasion is to be a young bullock without blemish. Purpose of this offering is to cleanse the sanctuary. So this will be a yearly procedure unknown to the law of Moses. The first day of each new year, there'll be a special offering for the cleansing of the sanctuary. And then verse 19 gives us the procedure which is to be followed. The priest shall take of the blood of the sin offering and put it upon 3 different structures. First of all, the doorpost of the house. Then we have the 4 corners of the ledge of the altar, and then the posts of the gate of the inner court. So this is also quite different from the Mosaic law, where the priest had to sprinkle the blood before the veil. And we see that in Leviticus 4 verses 6 to 7. And then blood was applied upon the horns of the altar in Leviticus 4 verse 7 and 18. Now the bullock was only used on the Day of Atonement. And we find it in Leviticus 16 verse 6, Leviticus 16 verse 6 and 11 to 14. So in those days, the bullock was used to sanctify only the altar. We find it in Exodus 29, 35 to 37. 29, 35 to 37. Now, normally it was a goat that was used for the sin offering, but we see that in Numbers 28, 15, Numbers 28, 15 and 29, 5, and also in 29 verses 11, 16, 19, well, virtually from verse 11 up to 38, you'll see it. Now, this whole system differs from the Mosaic law in two key ways. First of all, in the animal that was used or that was offered. Under the Mosaic law, it was a he-goat, but under millennial law, it's to be a bullock. In the way the bullock was, the second way, it differs in the way the bullock was disposed of. Under the Mosaic system, it had to be outside the camp, but under the millennial system, it would be within the temple compound area. In verse 20, he talks about the seventh day of the first month. And so shalt thou do on the seventh day of the month. He means that the same procedure we've just dealt with regarding the first day of the month, Nisan, is to be repeated on the seventh day of the same month. Now, the recipients of the sin offering are to be everyone that erreth or erreth. Hebrew word shagar here emphasizes that this means everyone who makes a mistake. That's occasioned by the weakness of the flesh and blood. So it's this type of sin that is talked about in Leviticus 4 verse 2 and Numbers 15 verse 22 and verse 27. Numbers 15, 22 and 27 and Leviticus 4, 2. So it is for someone who has made a mistake because of the weakness of the flesh, or secondly, also for him that is simple, as in Proverbs chapter 7 verse 7, Proverbs 7, 7. So this refers to someone who does not have all of his mental faculties intact. And the purpose is, so shall you make atonement for the house of Israel. Now, this atonement is made for those who from error entered into the forbidden area of the temple compound during the festivities. Now we're going to move on to deal with the offering of the Passover, for Passover. And this we find in verses 21 to 24. In the first month, in the 14th day of the month, you shall have the Passover. You got a drink. Excuse me. You shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. And upon that day shall the prince prepare for himself and for all the people of the land a bullock for a sin offering. In the 7 days of the feast he shall prepare a burnt offering to Jehovah, 7 bullocks and 7 rams without blemish, daily the 7 days, and a he-goat daily for a sin offering. And he shall prepare a meal offering, an ephah for a bullock, and an ephah for a ram, and a hin of oil to an ephah. So in these verses, 21 to 24, Ezekiel deals with the offerings for the Feast of Passover. Verse 21 gives us the date in the year and the occasion. We're still in the first month, remember, Nisan, and the 14th day of that month. And the occasion is, you shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Now, on the Mosaic law, Passover only lasts for 1 day, followed then by 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But in the kingdom, the feast of the Passover itself is to be of 7 days duration. And the obligation is that they shall, unleavened bread shall be eaten, no leaven. So it's just unleavened bread to be eaten in that 7-day period. In verses 22 to 23, he deals with the sin offering. In verse 22, we have the duty of the prince on that day, that is on the 14th of Nisan. The prince shall prepare, that is, King David will make these preparations in keeping with verse 17. He's going to prepare a bullock for a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land. This also differs from the Mosaic procedure. If you compare what is said here with Leviticus 23 verses 5 to 8, Leviticus 23, 5 to 8, and Numbers 28 verse 16 to 25. So it's Leviticus 23, 5 to 8, and Numbers 28, 16 to 25. In verse 13, he deals with the 7 days. In the 7 days of the feast, you shall prepare a burnt offering to Jehovah. So this was to be 7 bullocks and 7 rams without blemish every day, and a he-goat daily for a sin offering. Now this differs in number from the Mosaic system. If you compare what is said here with Numbers 28, 16 to 25. In verse 24, he deals with the meal offering, and he shall prepare a meal offering, an ephah for a bullock, an ephah for a ram, and a hin of oil to an ephah. So these measures also differ from the Mosaic system, as we see from Numbers 28 verse 20. What we learn here is that the Passover is going to be observed in the Messianic kingdom. Now we move on to the Feast of Tabernacles in verse 25. In the 7th month, and the 15th day of the month, in the feast shall he do like the 7 days, according to the sin offering, according to the burnt offering, and according to the meal offering, and according to the oil. So the date this occurs is in the 7th month, which is the month of Tishri, on the 15th day of the month, and the occasion is in the feast. Now, we know this feast in Leviticus 23 to be the Feast of Tabernacles. So the offerings for this feast are, he shall do the like the 7 days, meaning same as the 7 days of the Passover. So on this occasion, he's to offer the same type of sin offerings, burnt offerings, and meal offerings, and the same type of oil which was offered at the Feast of Passover. Again, see, this differs from the Mosaic system in 2 ways. First of all, in the quantity of offerings, as we see from Numbers 29, 12 to 14, or 12 to 34, sorry, Numbers 29, 12 to 34. Second, there is to be no commemoration on the 8th day, as there was under the Mosaic system in Numbers 29, 35 to 38. Now, like the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles will also be observed throughout the Messianic kingdom. So there's 2 of them, Tabernacles and Passover. And this is also confirmed by Zechariah 14, verses 16 to 19. Now we're going to look at the law of the inner eastern gate. Remember, the outer eastern gate is closed. This is verse 1 to 3. Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, the gate of the inner court that looketh toward the east shall be shut the 6 working days, but on the 7th day it shall be opened, and on the day of the new moon it shall be opened. And the prince shall enter by the way of the porch of the gate without, and he shall stand by the post of the gate. And the priest shall prepare his burnt offering and his peace offerings, and he shall worship at the threshold of the gate. Then he shall go forth, but the gate shall not be shut until the evening, and the people of the land shall worship at the door of that gate before Jehovah on the Sabbath and on the new moons. Now, so this passage here covers the millennial law as it relates to the inner eastern gate. This is verses 1 to 3, the inner eastern gate. Verse 1 deals with the shutting of that gate, thus saith the Lord Jehovah. So this emphasizes here the fact that God is speaking again instead of the angel. The gate of the inner court that looketh toward the east shall be shut the 6 working days, but on the Sabbath day it shall be opened, and on the day of the new moon it shall be opened. Now, the principle being enunciated here is that the inner eastern gate is to be shut and only opened on 2 occasions, on the Sabbath day, which is explained in verses 4 to 5, and on the day of the new moon, which we're going to see, which is on the 1st day of each month. We're going to see that in verses 6 to 7. Now remember that the outer eastern gate is to be permanently shut throughout the Messianic kingdom, as we have already discovered in previous lessons. Now, and that's because the Shekinah glory has entered in, and it will remain there right throughout the kingdom. Now, but the inner eastern gate is going to be shut generally for the 6 working days of the week, but it's then going to be open every Sabbath and on the first day of each month. And then we see in verse 2, he deals with the prince and the inner eastern gate. Now, just as the prince, which is King David here, has a specific role in relation to the outer eastern gate, so he'll also have a role in relation to the inner eastern gate. The prince shall enter by the way of the porch of the gate without. So from the outer court, the prince will enter the eastern inner gate by its porch, which opens outward into the inner court. The prince was allowed to go as far as the inner threshold of the inner eastern gate. He could go no further because that would put him inside the inner court where only the Levites were permitted to go. Now remember, David was of the tribe of Judah, and God goes on to say that he shall stand by the post of the gate. So after coming into the inner eastern gate, he's now to proceed to its west end, from which the vantage point he's able to see the sanctuary and the altar. And then from this position, he'll have a full view of what is going on in the inner court without setting foot inside the inner court. And it goes on to say that the priests shall prepare. Now, the priests of the sons of Zadok will be working inside the inner court. And as the prince watches them, they shall prepare his burnt offering and his peace offerings. This means that the prince's offerings, of course. He shall worship at the threshold of the gate on the Sabbath days and on the new moons, and then he shall go forth. So that is, he's going to leave the area of the gate. But the gate shall not be shut until the evening. So what we're seeing here is that after the prince leaves, this gate will be now left open for others to come and worship. And then on the evening of the Sabbath and new moon days, the gate will be shut once more. In verse 3, Ezekiel now tells us about the people and the inner eastern gate. And the people of the land shall worship at the door of that gate before Jehovah on the Sabbaths and on the new moons. And then the gate will be shut in the evening. So that is the law of the inner eastern gate. And since he has told us that this gate will be opened only on the Sabbath days and new moons, he now deals with the specific sacrifices for each of these occasions. In verses 4 to 5, we see the offerings for the Sabbath. And the burnt offering that the prince shall offer unto Jehovah shall be on the Sabbath day 6 lambs without blemish, and a ram without blemish. And the meal offering shall be an ephah for the ram, and the meal offering for the lambs as he's able to give, and a hin of oil to an ephah. So, in these verses, we come to the offerings for the Sabbath. Verse 4 deals with the burnt offering, and this is to include 6 lambs without blemish, and then a ram also without blemish. Now, this is different and more than what was required under the Mosaic system if we look at Numbers 28, verse 9. Numbers 28, 9. And then in verse 5, he deals with the meal offering. The meal offering shall be an ephah for the ram, and for the lambs it is to be determined as he's able to give. So, while the meal offering for the ram is set down, that's what you've got to do with the ram, what is required for the lambs is according to his ability to give. But for each ephah of the meal offering that he gives, he has to include a hin of oil. This also is more than the Mosaic system demanded. Again, Numbers 28:9 tells us this. Then we see the offerings for the new moon in verses 6 to 7. And on the day of the new moon, it shall be a young bullock without blemish, and 6 lambs and a ram. They shall be without blemish. And he shall prepare a meal offering, an ephah for the bullock, and an ephah for the ram, the lambs according as he is able, and a hin of oil to an ephah. So with these offerings on the day of the new moon in verses 6 to 7, in verse 6, he deals first with the burnt offering. It says, on the day of the new moon, that is on the first day of each month, it shall be a young bullock without blemish, also 6 lambs and 1 ram. They, that is, these lambs and the ram, shall be without blemish. Now, this also differs from the Mosaic requirements for the new moon in comparison with Numbers 28:11 to 15. And then in verse 7, he now deals with the meal offering. And he shall prepare a meal offering, an ephah for the bullock, and an ephah for the ram, and for the lambs according as he's able. Now note here that the meal offering is once again set for both the bullock and the ram. But for the lambs, the prince has a lot of freedom. Now, what we see also is that for every ephah that he gives, there must also be a hin of oil. Basically, the new moon meal offering is the same as the Sabbath offering, except for the bullock mentioned in verse 5. Now, this brings us to the next section. And here we see the laws of the entrance and the exit in verses 8 to 12. And when the prince shall enter, he shall go in by the way of the porch of the gate, and he shall go forth by the way thereof. But when the people of the land shall come before Jehovah in the appointed feasts, he that entereth by the way of the north gate to worship shall go forth by the way of the south gate. He that entereth by the way of the south gate shall go forth by the way of the north gate. He shall not return by the way of the gate whereby he came in, but shall go forth straight before him. Verse 10, and the prince, when they go in, shall go in the midst of them, and when they go forth, they shall go forth together. And in the feasts and in the solemnities, the meal offering shall be an ephah for a bullock, and an ephah for a ram, and for the lambs as he is able to give, and a hin of oil to an ephah. And when the prince shall prepare a freewill offering, a burnt offering, or peace offerings as a freewill offerings unto Jehovah, one shall open for him the gate that looketh toward the east, and he shall prepare his burnt offering and his peace offerings, as he doth on the Sabbath day. Then he shall go forth, and after his going forth, one shall shut the gate. Okay, now, verse 8 deals with the entry and exit of the prince. When the prince shall enter, and he enters on the Sabbath and new moon days, he shall go in by the way of the porch of the gate. Again, we're dealing here with the inner eastern gate. And he shall go forth by the way thereof. So the prince comes and goes by way of the inner eastern gate. But of course, he does not proceed all the way through the inner court. In verse 9 now, he deals with the people. When the people of the land shall come before Jehovah, and that is the occasion is in the appointed feasts, which according to Deuteronomy 16, verse 16, these appointed feasts are the feast of Passover, Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So when the people come on these occasions, because of their great numbers, there'll have to be a specific entry and exit system. So he that entereth by the way of the north shall go forth by the way of the south gate, and vice versa. So he's dealing here, of course, with the outer north and outer south gates. So anyone who comes into the temple compound by the way of the northern gate will have to exit through the outer southern gate. Now, because we're dealing with the ordinary people here and not the priests, these are the outer gates and outer courts as opposed to the inner courts and gates where the priests operate. He shall not return by the way of the gate whereby he came in, but shall go forth straight before him. So this is basically an orderly system of one-way traffic, if you like, and so it will avoid congestion and confusion. As for the outer eastern gate, that is shut permanently, and so will never be used. And that is why Ezekiel speaks only of entering and exiting via the northern and southern outer gates. And then in verse 10, he again comes back to the prince. When they go in, he shall go in the midst of them. So prince and people shall go in and out together. This means the prince will also be using the outer northern and southern gates. So he's coming and going as one of the people, with the exception that he has the opportunity to stop at the inner eastern gate to worship. And in verse 11, we have the offerings for the people, and the occasion is in the feasts. This is such as the festivals of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Now, so that's the feast. Now, in the solemnities or fixed occasions, which are the Sabbaths and new moons, the meal offering shall be an ephah. And that's for each of the bullocks and the rams. And again, for the lambs, as much as he's able to give, with a hin of oil for each ephah given. And then in verse 12, we have the free offering for the prince. And this refers to any offering that he might give spontaneously. It might be either a burnt offering or a peace offering. It's as a free will offering unto Jehovah. And at such times, one shall open for him the gate that looks toward the east. And this is the same thing. This is the inner eastern gate. Remember, the outer eastern gate is closed. So this is the inner eastern gate where he shall prepare his burnt offerings and his peace offerings. So this is the same thing he does on the Sabbath days in verses 1 to 2 of chapter 46. Then he shall go forth, and after his going forth, one shall shut the gate. So on the occasion of a free will offering by the prince, the inner eastern gate will be opened for him, but then closed again immediately after his departure. Normally, the inner eastern gate will always be shut except on the Sabbath and on the new moon days. On those days, it's going to stay open all day and is shut again in the evening. However, when King David decides to offer a free will offering to the Lord on any other day than the Sabbath or the new moon, then the gate will be opened for him so that he can make his free will offering. And then when he leaves, the gate will be immediately shut again and not remain open until sundown, as it will be on the Sabbath and the new moon days. In verses 13 to 15, we have the daily offerings. Thou shalt prepare a lamb a year old without blemish for a burnt offering unto Jehovah daily. Morning by morning shalt thou prepare it. Thou shalt prepare a meal offering with it morning by morning. The sixth part of an ephah and the third part of a hin of oil to moisten the fine flour. A meal offering unto Jehovah continually by a perpetual ordinance. Thus shall they prepare the lamb and the meal offering and the oil morning by morning for a continual burnt offering. So verse 13 deals with the daily sacrifice, which is they're going to have a lamb a year old without blemish. That's going to be a burnt offering. And now this also differs from the Mosaic system. If we compare what is said in Exodus 29, 38 to 39 and 41 to 42, and also Numbers 28, 3 to 4. The daily sacrifice in the kingdom is going to include a year-old lamb without blemish as a burnt offering. And he says this is to be done morning by morning. Now, this again differs from the Mosaic ritual in that the Mosaic sacrifice was offered both morning and evening. But under millennial law, it will be offered only in the morning. It says morning by morning. So there has to be no evening offering. And then in verse 14, he deals with the meal offering. And thou shalt prepare a meal offering with it morning by morning, the sixth part of an ephah, and the third part of a hin of oil to moisten the fine flour. So this also differs from the Mosaic system. If we compare what is said here with Exodus 29:40 and Numbers 28:5. So as we're going to see, we're getting into more and more differences from the Mosaic system, although there are some similarities. But there are too many differences to make it one and the same. A meal offering unto Jehovah continually by a perpetual ordinance. That means right throughout the kingdom. That's for 1,000 years. In verse 15, he summarizes the daily offering. Thou shalt prepare the lamb, the meal offering, and the oil. So on a daily basis, morning by morning, these three things have to be offered. First up, a year-old lamb without blemish as a burnt offering. Second, a meal offering comprising 1/6 of an ephah of fine flour and 1/3 of a hin of oil, and the purpose of it is to be a continual burnt offering. Now we see the prince and his inheritance in verses 16 to 18. Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, if the prince give a gift unto any of his sons, it is his inheritance. it shall belong to his sons. It is their possession by inheritance. But if he give of his inheritance a gift to one of his servants, it shall be his to the year of liberty. And then it shall return to the prince. But as for his inheritance, it shall be for his sons. Moreover, the prince shall not take of the people's inheritance to thrust them out of their possession. He shall give inheritance to his sons out of his own possession, that my people be not scattered, every man from his possession. Now, we've already pointed out that the land holdings of the prince are to be found on both east and west sides of the holy mountain, holy oblation. Now we are about to learn more about what is going to occur with it. In verse 16, we read of the law concerning sons. It says, if the prince give a gift unto any of his sons, again, the prince here is King David, so his sons will be those from among his sons, or maybe even his descendants in general, who were saved and resurrected, such as Solomon would be. Now, note something here, though, that it is his inheritance. It shall belong to his sons. It is their possession by inheritance. So this will be true throughout the kingdom, in that the land holdings of the prince on both sides of the holy oblation will belong to the prince, King David. And he can will it to any one of his sons. However, it will still belong to them as a continuous inheritance for the duration of the kingdom. And then in verse 17, we read about the law concerning the king's servants. But if he give of his inheritance a gift to one of his servants, it shall be his to the year of liberty. Now, the year of liberty is the year of Jubilee that comes around every 50 years. So there'll be 20 such Jubilee years in the Messianic kingdom. So if then, during a period of time, King David decides to give a portion of his land to one of his servants, that servant can hang on to it until the year of Jubilee. But then it shall return to the prince. It would automatically refer back to David as its owner. And this principle was found also under the Mosaic law in Leviticus 25, verse 10 to 13, Leviticus 25, 10 to 13, and Leviticus 27, verse 24, Leviticus 27, verse 24. Now, the reason why it must revert back is because of the last phrase of verse 17. But as for his inheritance, it shall be for his sons. So the only ones who can hang on to the land in perpetuity during the kingdom period will be the sons of David. Any servant can only hold it for a maximum of 50 years to the year of Jubilee, but his sons are the rightful owners. And now in verse 18, we have the law concerning confiscation. Moreover, the prince shall not take of the people's inheritance to thrust them out of their possessions. So this was the practice of the kings in the past. One example is in 1 Kings 21, 1 to 29. 1 Kings 21, 1 to 29. He shall give his inheritance to his sons out of his own possessions. Again, his possessions will be located on the east and west sides of the holy oblation. Now, because it will belong to the prince, he'll be able to will sections of it to his sons. But some of this land could be given temporarily to servants, and this is his own exclusive possession. And the reason he's not to confiscate any more territory is that my people be not scattered, every man from his own possession, or from his possession. Now we look at the boiling places in verses 19 to 24. This is where the sacrificial meat, which can be eaten by the priests, is to be boiled. We have two different places here. The first place we're going to look at is the place for the Zadokites. We see this in verses 19 and 20 of chapter 46. Then he brought me through the entry, which was at the side of the gate, into the holy chambers for the priests, which looked toward the north. And behold, there was a place on the hinder part westward. And he said unto me, this is the place where the priests shall boil the trespass offerings and the sin offering, and where they shall bake the meal offering, that they bring them not forth into the outer court to sanctify the people. So the first of these boiling places, we see in 19 and 20, is for the Zadokite priests. the ones who are actually working in the inner court and the temple buildings. In verse 19, we have another prophetic transport here. Then he brought me through the entry which was at the side of the gate into the holy chambers for the priest. The holy chambers mentioned in verse 19 are the holy cells he described in detail back in chapter 42, verses 1 to 9. Chapter 42, there it is on the screen, which looked toward the north. This means they opened toward the outer court northward. And behold, there was a place on the hinder part westward. So what he's saying here is at the extreme west end of the north row of the longer block of priest chambers in the inner court was a kitchen. If you look back at the diagram of the temple compound, that might help you to locate these chambers. In verse 20, we have the purpose of these particular places. Their usage, the angel says, is the place where the priest shall boil the trespass offering and the sin offering, and where they shall bake the meal offering. So this is where they'll partake of that which is to be donated to them. And the reason is given that they bring them not forth into the outer court to sanctify the people. So what they're not allowed to do with their garments in chapter 44, verse 19, they're also not allowed to do with their food either. Again, they have to maintain a clear separation between the sacred and the secular. However, the Levites who will be functioning in the outer court will also have boiling places, which we see in verses 21 to 24. Then he brought me forth into the outer court and caused me to pass by the four corners of the court. And behold, in every corner of the court there was a court. In the four corners of the court there were courts enclosed, 40 cubits long and 30 broad. And these four in the corners were of one measure. And there was a wall round about in them, round about the four, and boiling places were made on the walls round about. Then said he unto me, These are the boiling houses, where the ministers of the house shall boil the sacrifice of the people. So in verse 21, we again have a prophetic transport. This time he brought me forth into the outer court and caused me to pass by the four corners of the court. The point here is that Ezekiel is now brought into the outer court and taken on a complete circuit around it, so that he's able to view all four corners of the outer court where the Levites' boiling places are to be located. And behold, in every corner of the outer court there was a court. So Ezekiel is taken by the angel from the inner court into the outer court, where he's now shown the four enclosures or smaller courts located at the four corners of the outer court. And these small enclosures are the kitchens for the Levites. And then in verse 22, he gives us the measurements. In the four corners of the court, there were courts enclosed. This is summarizing what he just said in verse 21. The length was 40 cubits, 70 feet from east to west. The breadth was 30 cubits, 52 feet roughly, north to south. And so these four in the corners were of one measure. In other words, all four of these kitchens were the same size, which with one in each corner of the outer court of the temple compound. And then in verse 23, he mentions their walls. There was a wall round about in them, round about the four, and boiling places were made onto the walls round about. So on the inside of the corner angles, there were four smaller walls low to the ground. Low recesses were constructed within these low walls to act as fireplaces, with openings in the top so that pots could be placed over the fire. Apparently these kitchens were without a roof, obviously to allow the smoke to escape upwards and to pass out into the open air. Now in verse 24, we're given their purpose. These are the boiling houses where the ministers of the house shall boil the sacrifice of the people. So that's their purpose, where the ministers of the house or the Levite caretakers of the temple compound, which we saw back in chapter 44, verses 9 to 14. This is where they'll be able to cook and bake their bread. So this now completes our study on the millennial system of priesthood and sacrifice. Okay, thank you for coming along tonight. Study hard, grow strong. We'll see you next session.